Welcome to the Hillsdale Online Courses Podcast. I'm Kyle Mernon, the Director of Online Learning at Hillsdale College.
And I'm Juan, the Director of Marketing for Online Learning here at the college. Welcome back to the Hillsdale Online Courses Podcast. We are on to Lecture 3 of the Real American Founding today, Rights and Consent.
Yeah, and today you'll learn what I would, for my money, say is probably the biggest misconception of the founders' political theory today, right? We hear rights all the time in our political discourse. It's a common thing, and a lot of times we connect it to the founding. But for the past, I would say, at least 100 years, we've had this new conception of rights that is in conflict with the founders' understanding and in deep conflict. And so I think what you'll get is a very interesting discussion from Dr. Azerrad and Dr. West as they unpack that and start to show you, what the founders really meant when they said rights.
And something that Dr. West taught me as a student was the importance of duties when thinking about rights. Typically, we tend to think about rights as in, what do I get? Okay, I become a citizen. In my case, literally, I became a citizen, and I get all these rights, I get all these benefits, all these things that the country is supposed to give me as a citizen. Okay, but what are the corresponding duties that I have as a citizen? Every right has a corresponding duty. And when you first ask people, okay, what's the corresponding duty of a right? Yeah, I remember the first time West brought that up in class, and I was thinking, well, what is it? I couldn't even think about it. Now it's
Yep.
more automatic, right? There's a right to free speech. Okay, what's the corresponding duty? Well, to be responsible with your speech. You have to make sure that you don't speak nonsense. Make sure you speak things that are true and good and that are good for people. And so rights always come with duties.
No, that's a beautiful and it's so true about how Dr. West treats this entire course. I will make one other point. Consent oftentimes is seen as a sleepy term, but there's a lot there. And one of the things that I love about the course is he gets into the hard cases about consent, right? Mm-hmm. We say that so often. We think, that just means government by election. Well, what happens when government is no longer serving its purposes? And what can the citizens do about that? Can we disobey laws that are passed in the right way? He's going to get into that. Dr. Azerrad and Dr. West are going to have a really interesting conversation on that topic and on many other tough cases from the founding. I hope that you're enjoying this conversation. If you are, I hope you'll go to hillsdale.edu/course and look at some of our other courses. And in the end, I really do hope that you'll sign up for this course and take it. One of the things that I'm often asked in this role is, where do you film these courses? Do you go to a fancy studio somewhere? How do you pull this off? What we really do is we find places on campus and we try to highlight those so you can get a little bit of a flavor, a little bit of a feel for what it's like to be a Hillsdale College student. This particular course was actually filmed in our hotel and conference center, one of the rooms that you would go to if you attended a speech or came to visit campus. You could see that. I hope you will look at that course, see what that room looks like, get a little feel for Hillsdale College, and then maybe even come over and visit us someday and see the campus for yourself. So go ahead, check that course out, see what it looks like at hillsdale.edu/course.
And now let's turn to Lecture 3, Rights and Consent, with Professors Azerrad and West.
So let's pick up where we left off last time. We covered laws of nature, the idea of equality. What about rights? That is one term that everyone loves in America. The right, the left, the wokies, the libertarians. There's a broad consensus that in America we have rights. But clearly we don't understand rights today the same way that the founders did. So let's first begin by trying to establish, what did the founders mean when they said that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights?
The way I understand it, and this is also partly based on the state constitutions, rights are natural rights or inalienable rights. They're rights you have as a human being independently of the gift of government. What's their relation to equality? The answer is it's precisely because we're all created equal, that is, equally free, equally independent of other human beings' will, that we have rights. So you could say the concept of rights spells out the moral implications of the doctrine of human equality, that no one should be ruled without consent. Because what are the things that are implied by not being ruled? Well, it means, for one thing, nobody can make you a slave, so there's a right to liberty. Nobody can take away your life. You can't be in the grip of someone else's authority and power. So the right to life is part of equality. Everyone equally. The right to acquire property, because that's something in you. But you have a natural ability and liberty to acquire property by labor, by exchange, by receiving gifts. Okay. That's a natural right in the sense that nothing government gives you. Government doesn't give you that right. You have it by nature. The right to possess property too. If you've acquired property through your labor, it's yours, independent. So nobody else has that right to come in and take that away. Otherwise, they'd be ruling you without your consent. So it all goes back to equality. And so when the founders made their lists of rights, they sometimes made them long and sometimes short. Jefferson in the Declaration, he has pursuit of happiness. Okay, that's part of your liberty. You have the freedom to decide, what do I think is going to make my life better? And I have a right to do that. But all the rights in some way go back to that basic idea. So you can add in, if you want, the right to religious liberty, the right to worship, the right to keep and bear arms, right? If you go out and buy your own arm, you should be able to keep it. Right? That's a natural right. You should be able to travel, the right to, as one of the founders mockingly put it, he says, what are we going to put in our Bill of Rights? The right to get up when you want, go to sleep when you want, the right to eat breakfast when you want. He says, you can't list all the rights. That's all the possible things that human beings could do in the world. But what you don't have, though, in the founding is a right to the assistance of other people. You don't have a right to welfare. You don't have a right to health care. You don't have a right to self-esteem by making other people praise you for whatever you're doing, whether they like it or not. What we call today human rights, they would say, well, you have to make a distinction between the natural rights versus the rights that are created by law that don't necessarily exist by nature.
Yeah, the two main rights we seem to have added today, both of which, eat into or cut against natural rights, is the right to positive goods, to a job, to housing, to social security, to healthcare, and then the right to be honored, i.e. not to be criticized, which restricts other people's freedom of speech. So the one restricts the freedom of speech and the other obviously eats into the other person's property rights.
What people like Dewey and Hillary Clinton and others have in mind when they talk that way is government has a positive duty to give you things that you need. Self-esteem, honor, money, promotion, affirmative action, all kinds of things that otherwise would not happen spontaneously in ordinary human interaction. Government has to be there and take care of that for you. Healthcare, most obviously. And the modern state, the modern liberal state, starting in the progressive era and then radicalized now, of course, assumes that those positive rights are far more important than the negative ones of being protected in your life, liberty, and property. And of course, what that's led to is increasingly the non-enforcement of civil law.
So what's the theoretical relationship between civil rights and natural rights? Because if there's one term today in America you don't hear a lot in the public square, is the idea of natural rights, but you hear an awful lot about civil rights.
Yeah. Well, okay. So from the point of view of the founders, natural rights are rights you have independently of whether you're even in a government at all or even if you're under an oppression. You always have those natural rights, even if you can't effectively exercise them. But civil rights, the founders used that term to mean the rights you have under law when your natural rights are properly protected. So Madison in Federalist 51 uses the term civil rights, which, and in the context he is implying government protection of your right to own property by punishing people who might take it away. So your civil rights, he says, are protected. And he's complaining about Rhode Island at that time was passing laws that, in effect, took property away from people by creating artificial inflation. So took money away from creditors. To put it more broadly, in the founding, civil rights are the rights you possess as a citizen if the government is doing its proper job in fulfilling its mission to protect and to secure the natural rights you have by nature.
And yet, and this is what people today have the hardest time grasping, is the founders were intransigently committed to the idea of equal natural rights, but they did not believe that all citizens would have equal civil rights.
Right.
So the woman question, for example.
Yeah.
Or the freed blacks. The founders did not see a contradiction between affirming the equal natural rights of mankind and having a political community in which not all present have the same civil rights, that only some get to vote, for example.
Yes.
So that's a tough question to ask you given the prejudices of the age, but how would you, if you were defending them in a court of law, what was their reasoning? How could they maintain what to us strikes us as a fundamental contradiction?
Two different cases you brought up. One is should the civil rights of men and women be the same under all circumstances? And their answer was that if for unmarried men and women, they should be the same. Basically, women have the same right to travel, go into business, buy and sell property, have form contracts, be protected by the laws against murder and so on. Fine. That's the same. But what's different is that when women got married, when people got married, then there was a different set of laws that kicked in about the relations and duties of husband and wives. But the basic difference being that women and men were thought to have an appropriately different role in the household. And there are some minimal rules or expectations of women that would not be expected of men.
So how did it affect their civil rights as
well?
women?
For example, there was a Supreme Court case shortly after the Civil War where this came up, where Illinois had refused to allow this woman in Illinois to pass the bar, to become a lawyer accredited in the Illinois court system. And the Supreme Court said, well, that's the state of Illinois can make that choice. And since it's based on this idea that men and women really do have mostly different roles in life, we can accept that the men and women would not have the same basic privilege of citizenship in this case. So in the same, with regard to free blacks, that was an entirely separate question. Then it was a question of, let's say, if a black person is given his freedom or was always free, his parents were free in America, does that person have the right to be a citizen? And the founders' view of citizenship was always the same for everyone, white, black, anybody. And that is, you have to have the consent of the community. And if you're going to have, if you want to be a citizen, you have to ask, and the community has to say yes. Now, at the very beginning, we talked about this in a previous session. At the beginning of a political order, it requires everybody to unanimously consent to be part of the one people that will then form a constitution and live by its laws. Once the community started, though, the same consent principle kicks in, and it means that no one has the right to be a citizen except those that the community chooses to admit as citizens. And so you had this anomaly, you had this strange situation where you had a large number of free blacks in America pre-Civil War, who in most states were not allowed to be or treated as full citizens. Some state governments referred to them as denizens, like kind of a resident legal alien.
But are you still entitled to the protection of the law?
So the non-citizens would be entitled to the protection of the laws in the sense of laws against violence. They would be protected also in the due process rights that you have to enjoy, that you have to have in order to have a fair trial, the right to call witnesses and so on.
But you might not have the right to bear arms, to vote, to serve on a jury.
Right. And some cities had curfews for black people. Some cities had rules on blacks owning arms. This is free blacks now. We're not even talking about slaves. And pre-Civil War. So one of the things that happened, of course, in the Civil War was that the 14th Amendment meant that situation would no longer pertain in America. We would from now on have blacks as full citizens. And really anyone who was born in America and under the jurisdiction of our laws, which mostly meant not tourists, but what are the rights of non-citizens who reside in America? And that pre-Civil War was, they did have an answer for that that's different from what happened after. once blacks became citizens.
And their argument was that no one is entitled to join a political community without the consent of that existing political community.
That's the thing I think that most people today have a lot of trouble with. They really don't, they just find it offensive, morally offensive, that you could claim that these free blacks, having gotten out of slavery in the first place, bad as that was, that they're still, then they're not even entitled to become citizens. And that was, in fact, the way they were treated pre-Civil War. And the founders did believe that was consistent with their principles. And it was argued, it was justified always in terms of the problem of forming the one people. That is, are the free blacks capable of being equal citizens with the white population? And a lot of people observing actual conduct, like high crime rates, high welfare rates among free blacks, high poverty rates, and a lot of high rates of people in the poorhouse. A lot of people said, these people, whatever they are, whatever the reason is, maybe because of the way that they were treated as slaves, but they don't really seem to be able to be part of our community.
And then there's the whole psychological problem of one race having enslaved another one and all of the bad blood that this creates. I mean, Jefferson talks about this, the 10,000 recollections of past injustices.
Right.
That also.
And Jefferson, of course, advocated that emancipation should take place only if it could be simultaneous with removal of blacks to a different place, geographical location, some other country.
To form their own political community.
Precisely. So they had a right to liberty, but they didn't have a right to live as free as citizens in the United States. That was Jefferson's view, and the view of many at the pre-Civil War, which is why they had the colonization idea, and they did start a colony in Liberia. It's,
didn't work out all that well, but
the idea behind it was this idea that they have a right to liberty, but they don't have a right to live in the United States as free citizens.
Whether you've just started teaching or spent decades in the classroom, there's always more to learn. But where do you start? Well, here at Hillsdale College, we have the answer for you. Tried and True, a primer on sound pedagogy by Hillsdale College professor Daniel Copeland. In this little book, you'll read lessons from more than 25 years of Dr. Copeland's classroom experience. It's all distilled into 14 easy-to-read chapters on lesson planning, assignments, and classroom management. And it will help you improve your skills and inspire you as a teacher, one of our most important professions. Whether you've been in front of the classroom for years or this is your first year, when you read Tried and True, you'll find something to help you keep improving every single day. You don't need to go at it alone. Let Dr. Copeland's real-world experience encourage you and inspire you. You can get your copy today at hillsdale.edu/true. That's hillsdale.edu/TRUE. Thanks for listening.
I want to talk about this term inalienable. I've always found it a difficult one to explain to students because our rights, it seems to me, are and are not inalienable. So they're inalienable insofar as you're a human being, you possess rights. But once you join a political community, you give up some of these liberties. So for example, you may get killed by the government, justifiably so, if you're convicted of a high crime. And that seems that you did give up on your right to life to some extent. How does one think about that clearly? Are they or are they not inalienable?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. They're both, but the way I would put it is that your natural rights are inalienable. You always possess a right to life, to liberty, and so on. But when you join a political society, you alienate them conditionally. And the condition is, as long as the government that you've joined is doing its basic job of protecting you and your fellow citizens, you have an obligation to obey, and you don't have the right to resume your liberty that you have in the state of nature. But at the moment that the government is no longer providing protection, then you can choose. You can say, no, I'm going to resume the exercise of my rights. I think Jefferson in the Declaration, The king has dissolved our legislatures. The people's right to make their own laws, they resumed their right. They have it. They always have that power to make laws for themselves that exists in nature. It's the power to govern themselves by their own consent.
Or when law and order breaks down, as it did during the BLM riots, you have a right to defend your life when the government doesn't do so.
Yes. A natural right, although the government might prosecute you anyway because they've just decided we're not going to allow anyone to defend themselves against these rioters, which in fact is the way it actually was treated in many jurisdictions.
One right that everyone is enamored with post-60s, and that's part of the pernicious legacy of the civil rights movement, is the right to disobey laws that one deems to be unjust. Would the founders recognize the idea that individual citizens get to decide which laws to obey and disobey based on whether or not they think they're just?
No, that's a power you alienate. You alienate the right to pick and choose once you've joined a government. The basic condition of the social compact, as they called it, is that the people decide to create a community, to establish a constitution, which in turn creates laws that the people are contractually obliged to obey, period. That's the contract. And the idea that there's this opt-out clause for a law that you don't like or that you think is unfair or so on, that's crazy. Now, there's always the right to revolution, but it has to be just, it has to be really justified. It can't just be, I just don't like this Vietnam War or whatever. You can't just choose.
And the right to revolution is, strangely enough, is a collective one.
So practically speaking, you have to decide what you're able to resist. But no, under normal circumstances, you don't get to choose which laws to obey or not obey. I heard a lot of people defending the BLM riots.
Yeah, if anything, we've come to equate it as the greatest thing a citizen can do is to protest, break unjust laws. I mean, we've come to equate that with citizenship.
Well, protest is fine from the point of view of the founders. Break the laws? No. Protest, fine. Go out there and demonstrate. Go out there and hold up signs and say everybody, that the government's been misbehaving. Fine, that's part of the democratic process, but not killing people, not burning property, not breaking into people's homes. Those are violations of ordinary law that you can't justify under the terms that you've made as a citizen under the compact.
And yet, let's apply this to today. We have a government that is, in many regards, tyrannically overreaching. And we wouldn't say that the founders would suggest that the average citizen put up with all of these arbitrary, capricious, and tyrannical regulations. Just take the COVID madness. On the one hand, you're duty-bound to obey the law, but should an American citizen put up with everything that comes out of the health bureaucracy of the U.S.?
Well, this gets into the question also that came up in the civil rights movement. One of the points of the civil rights movement was that some of the laws that were being violated were unconstitutional. That was part of the argument that was made in the 1960s, that we're not appealing to a higher law, we're appealing to our own constitutional law, which is higher than the state law, but is not independent of civil law. And similarly, in regard to COVID, the governors who made these proclamations, sure, there were state laws that said the governor can do anything he or she wants to in an emergency. There were such laws. They were laws that were not laws from the point of view of the founders. The founders would have said, you can't have a law that says the government can do whatever it wants whenever it declares an emergency. That means you've given up the rule of law. Those laws in the states that had them, like Michigan, they came into effect during the Progressive era.
So there is, according to the founding, a right to disobey unjust laws.
Yes, laws that violate the terms of the government, the terms the government operates under. So in regard to the social compact, the citizens have rights and duties, but so does the government. And yes, you have a right to disobey, but it has to be genuinely, it has to be serious and not frivolous. And it also has to be exercised prudently. Like in the 1960s, arguably many of the things that people said were unconstitutional were not unconstitutional. They weren't illegal. They were just things that they didn't like. Like, I want a job, and I haven't gotten that job, and therefore my rights are violated. So that was part of the movement, was to claim we deserve jobs. And people at the time of the founding and even now would say, what do you mean you deserve a job? You should try to go out and find one. And if you can't find one that you like, you should settle for the one you can get.
Do we have a right, according to the political theory of the American founding, to withdraw our consent, rather to leave a political community after we have consented to join it? Can you leave at will? Is your consent to belong revocable unilaterally?
Yeah, well, that was a fact. That was a question that people at the time of the founding faced. In theory and in principle, you should be able to leave if you want to live somewhere else, live in a different country. And 2 of the states actually put it into their constitution that all human beings have a natural right to emigrate and go to any other country that will accept them, right? Just find someplace that's willing. They ran into difficulties in the 1790s because people who were caught working with the French in their attacks on British shipping, they would say, oh, well, I'm no longer an American citizen, I'm a French citizen. And so the Americans tightened up the requirements for expatriation. You could still do it, but they set up a process to make it more formalized, and that became the understanding. Yes, you do have a right to leave, but we're going to regulate it to make sure that it's not abused so that people can just get away with not serving their country in a time of war.
Did they consider the issue of dual citizenship, which I find is, from the point of view of social contract theory, completely absurd, that you would join 2 distinct political communities? I mean, if you think of citizenship as benefits from the government and a passport to travel more easily, the more the better. But if you think of it in the way the founders did, you can only really belong to one political community at a time. Did they ever take up the specific issue of people being dual or triple citizens?
Well, it was implied in the naturalization oath, which we still give. I mean, the Americans still have a naturalization oath that requires you to renounce all subjection to any foreign power of any kind.
But it's not enforced in the sense of the State Department.
It's not enforced.
Yeah, it's not enforced.
In other words, we still give lip service to the founders and then do what we like. No, you're right. The reason is because now we don't think of citizenship as having duties connected to it. It's rights. It's the idea that, I get on welfare, get on Social Security, get on food stamps, crazy. That we would think of it that way. That's not what citizenship is supposed to be.
But this is where I think you're making a claim that will rattle many, because the founding is primarily, and I would even say overwhelmingly, couched in the language of rights. I'm an American, I have rights, I'm entitled to this. I don't disagree with you that there are duties, but you emphasize the duties, but I guess, couldn't you say what you're trying to do, you're going to have a harder time pointing to these consensus documents at the time of the founding that have rousing invocations of duties? Isn't the rousing language, the big statements, mostly about rights and the duties are secondary? Where do you find great affirmations of civic duties at the time of the founding?
Well, first of all, any kind of political speech, like a public speech, would always talk about rights and duties. So George Washington, right from the very start of his presidency, the first inaugural address, he says to Congress, he says, I hope that Congress passes laws based on the idea of the moral duties of mankind, because no government can survive and no man can be happy without performing the duties he owes to himself and to the ruler of the universe. Similarly, when he gave this State of the Union address, Congress, please, I hope you guys can find a way to pass laws to support education, because education is absolutely crucial in helping men understand their rights and their duties as citizens, so that they are, faithfully obey the laws, and at the same time understand the need for vigilance against oppressive government. That was always the way the people at the time of the founding talked. Now, at the time of the actual revolution, 1776, that was the time for rights language, right? We got rights, you British need to butt out. Later, in the actual, in the constitutions, when they talked about this, or when statesmen discussed it, it was always the rights and duties thing. We're always together.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you, Tom. In the next part of the conversation, we're going to get into this question of how is it that the government goes about securing the rights of the people.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about America's founding or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you can find over 40 free online courses, including American Citizenship and Its Decline with Victor Davis Hanson, Ancient Christianity, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thank you for listening.